Hey guys, I'm Heidi Prieb. Welcome back to my channel, or welcome if you're new here. This month on this channel, we've been talking about resilience. And in a lot of ways, what it means to be emotionally mature is to have resilience when it comes to your own self concept. So, the ability to show up as you are in a variety of different circumstances and to be fluid and adaptable enough in your self concept to be able to respond appropriately to a wide variety of situations. So, maturity for myself was a really difficult concept to wrap my head around when I started intentionally pursuing it. I used to think of maturity as basically someone who was just well adapted to the adult world. So, someone who knew how to be on time and respect their responsibilities and navigate through challenging interpersonal situations well. But the more in touch with myself I got as I was going through the attachment healing process, the more I realized that it's very easy and tempting to perform maturity instead of actually embodying it. So, today, what we're going to be talking about largely is why we cannot actually be mature, well rounded human beings unless and until we are in touch with our own authenticity. So, we're going to go over 5 things that tend to get mistaken on the surface for maturity, some of the tells that someone might be practicing that thing without having their authentic needs, wants, and preferences integrated into it, and what needs to happen instead in order for that sense of maturity, whether it's ours or someone else's, to be more resilient across a wide variety of situations. So, in the healing process, I had to take my definition of maturity, which was some version of navigating the world and relationships well, and I had to add something to the end of it, which is navigating the world and relationships well as the person you actually are. So, not as this disembodied version of yourself or this person you're trying to kind of pretend you are, but as someone who actually knows and is in consistent touch with themselves and who does a good job of navigating the authentic relationship between oneself and the rest of the world. So, around the time that I got really interested in this topic of maturity, because I recognized myself at a certain point in my life as someone who was not maturing at the rate that I was hoping I would, I started diving into what people are actually talking about when they use this word. And there are a whole bunch of different measures of maturity. There's all of this research that's been done on it, and everyone seems to use slightly different constructs. So I've narrowed it down to 5 things that condense much of what people tend to talk about when they talk about what skills go into maturity. So we're going to look at these 5 constructs. And we're also going to look at the main error that a lot of us make when evaluating that construct in ourselves or other people, as well as what it means to get in touch with it more directly. So we will start off with the concept of independence. Most people, whether they are researchers or lay people, agree that to be mature as an adult means that you've achieved some level of independence. Now, the thing that we very often mistake for independence, that leads us to performing it more so than actually embodying it, is we mistake either counterdependence or martyrdom for independence. When we are behaving in a counterdependent way, what we are essentially doing is actually fearing depending on anything, which means we are trying to design a life where we do not have to take anything from anyone or any of the systems that we're surrounded in order to be okay. And what this generally leads to, and also where it generally comes from, is emotional avoidance, which is not a particularly resilient trait. Because as soon as we're in a situation where we would actually best be served by drawing from the resources of other people or our environments, we're not going to be able to do that. Now, the other thing we mistake independence for is martyrdom. So essentially deciding that we have no needs and we are only here to give and serve other people. And the problem with this framework is that in both cases, it's just not true. We all have interpersonal needs. We all have things that we need to take from our environment and from other people in order to keep ourselves feeling okay. And true maturity is actually being aware of that and being able to call out for ourselves consciously which needs we have and designing a life where we are going to be able to get those needs fulfilled so that we can stay healthy and resourced enough to give back to our environments, not from a place of superiority, but from a place of deep cooperation. I'll never forget learning to code this one assessment when I was doing my master's degree that was essentially assessing how parents were adapting to having children. And one of the questions that got asked was, what do you do when you are feeling overwhelmed or angry or when you need support? And the parents who could give a coherent response to that question, so who could both admit and identify that they sometimes got angry or felt overwhelmed and that they needed support, were generally marked as being a lot better adapted than the parents who denied that they felt any of those things and wanted to keep insisting that they were perfectly fine all of the time and were consistently able to respond to their children's needs in a stress-free way. That simply is not true for anybody. All of us need support systems. All of us have the best and healthiest relationship to giving when we are receiving in approximately equal measure. And so when we go out looking for maturity in ourselves or other people, we don't just want to look at how good am I at standing on my own in life, or how good is someone else at making it through life without any support. We want to look at how good am I at recognizing where my weaknesses lie and how I can design my environment in a way where I am able to consistently get the support I need in order to be my best, most charitable self without burning out or having to chronically avoid my own feelings. This is what true maturity in the realm of independence looks like. It looks a lot more like interdependence than it does counterdependence. The second thing that pops up on almost all measures of emotional maturity is self-awareness. Most people across the board agree that to be mature means to know who you are, what you want, and what's important to you in life. And I don't disagree, but I think that it's very easy to mistake having a lot of well-rehearsed stories about ourselves for actual self-awareness. Self-awareness, at its core, is generally about how present we can stay with ourselves on a moment-to-moment basis. Sometimes having a lot of labels that we put on ourselves can actually be a way of avoiding just being present with what it feels like to be us. So when we are looking at self-awareness, we don't just want to look at our ability or someone else's ability to describe our own experiences. We want to look at the ability to stay present with and tolerate uncomfortable emotional experiences without dissociating, at least most of the time. Generally, this is the highest degree of self-awareness that actually matters, because it's the kind of self-awareness that we can actually put into practice in a way that helps us integrate new ideas about ourselves and other people and the world as we go through life. This is very different than spending a lot of time thinking about how we want to represent ourselves and then telling everybody stories that we think will win them over to that idea of ourselves that we want to put out there. The most self-aware people know that their self-image is constantly changing. And if they want to be as accurate as possible about themselves, they have to be very open and receptive to feedback on how other people are perceiving them. And to be attempting to control the narrative too tightly on who we are generally signifies some form of defensiveness or internal fear of seeing oneself in a certain light, which tends to make us a little less self-aware than the average person because there are areas where we are blocked from knowing ourselves deeply. So again, when we're looking for self-awareness in ourselves or others, what we want to be paying attention to is how present does this person seem to be most of the time? And to what extent are they open to feedback? These two things are going to go a long way generally in increasing our ability to be accurate about our self-concept. The third construct that shows up over and over again in conversations about emotional maturity is the construct of self-regulation. And the easiest trap we can fall into when we are trying to evaluate self-regulation in either ourselves or other people is mistaking the absence of emotion for really good regulation of emotion. So a lot of us tend to naturally think of people who just seem really stoic and unaffected by life as people who have exceptional self-regulation skills online, when in reality, once again, this is often a product of avoidance. Unless someone's calm nature comes not from suppressing their feelings, but from being so comfortable with welcoming them in whenever they show up and expressing them in a raw and direct way that there's just very little they're holding on to. So their nervous system can enjoy a more general state of calm, knowing that every time a wave arises, the wave will be welcomed in, appreciated, and expressed. When we live this way, we tend to not fall into either patterns of rumination, so endlessly trying to analyze how we're feeling, or suppressing and ignoring how we're feeling. So, generally, some signs that we're not regulating ourselves particularly well is that we're spending a lot of time either thinking about how we want to present our feelings to other people. Because when we're spending a lot of time fixating on how we want other people to perceive our emotions, it's generally because we're not trying to be seen in exactly the experience we're having. It's because we are trying to get something out of the other person or make them feel a particular way about us that is then going to regulate us. Or if we're getting really stuck in patterns of analyzing and obsessing over our feelings, this is generally another sign that we are not very good at staying with the raw experience of them. Other patterns of poor self-regulation might be withholding a lot of our feelings, so making the choice to not express a lot of what we're going through, or feeling pretty emotionally shut down and numbed out a lot of the time, or deliberately seeking ways to numb out our feelings because they're chronically too intense. And none of this is stuff we want to be shaming ourselves for, right? Not having good emotional regulation skills is often just a product of never having been taught them. So there's totally work that we can do in this department to push our development forward. But the thing we want to keep in mind is that to be well regulated basically just means to be comfortable with our raw emotions as they arrive in our body, to be able to label them to some extent that is helpful for us in making sense of them, and also to be able to express them directly without too much shame or rumination in the way. So, for example, to be able to notice when something is making us angry, and to be able to just say it in the moment that we're feeling it, or to notice that we're feeling sad or down, and to give ourselves the space that our body needs to be a little bit more downregulated for a period of time. So, having good emotional regulation skills is not about feeling one thing all of the time. It is, in fact, about welcoming in all of our emotions and being able to work with them effectively so that we are not holding chronic tension or stress in our body by virtue of trying to avoid, get rid of, or change certain emotions that really just want to be expressed. And again, this might take some education because if we don't know how to express our emotions in a way that is non-abusive, it's going to be a little bit of a road to getting there. But this is all stuff that can absolutely be learned. The thing we want to be watching out for the most, though, when we're thinking about our ability to be in right relationship with our emotions or other people's, is the extent to which we're able to be congruent. So how much do our insides and our outsides match? How much are we making clear to other people how it is that we feel on the inside, without all of these layers of stories and interpretation and blame or whatever it is on top of our feelings? The extent to which we can experience the raw form of them and be honest about our raw experience of them is generally the extent to which we can be congruent and in right relationship with our feelings. The next construct that a lot of people bring up when it comes to evaluating emotional maturity is interpersonal conflict resolution skills. So, how well can we navigate through situations where what we want is at odds with what somebody else who matters to us wants? And I think the easiest thing to mistake for good interpersonal skills, especially in this day and age, is people walking around talking like they are an HR department, rather than just being embodied about what they feel. And I have a lot of empathy for this. I get why it happens. And I think in the future, I will probably make a video that directly addresses the whole phenomenon of therapy speech being used in everyday conversations now. When we do not have a lot of good language for our emotions and for what our needs are and for the boundaries that we want to set, it can be really tempting to go almost overly clinical in setting those boundaries down or in communicating those things to other people. But if in our everyday lives we are speaking to our partners and our friends and our loved ones like we are reading directly out of a psychology textbook, it's usually an indication that we're actually quite afraid of expressing what we actually feel or think in its raw form and getting rejected. and maybe not knowing how to deal with that rejection if it does come online. But a humongous part of having actual mature conflict resolution skills is knowing both how to be vulnerable, which means how to put your feelings out there in a way that is honest, but not necessarily guaranteeing that the other person is going to respond properly to it, and knowing how to manage your disappointment if you don't get what you want out of your relational dynamics. So, real interpersonal maturity is not about being super clinical about our wants and needs. It's about actually being able to advocate for them from our body and stay present and on the page with the other person involved as to any impact that that might be having on them. So, what we're really going for here is a sense of equanimity, of feeling like we are finding the right balance between our needs and someone else's, which includes knowing when those things are just too at odds for us to be really close to another person, and being able to process and adjust around that without making either person the villain. And when we can do that, where we end up is a place where we're able to be flexible and responsive to other people's needs and relationships without abandoning our own. And this is a really hard place to get to. I'm not going to sugarcoat this, especially if we grow up insecurely attached. We're probably going to be at a significant deficit in this category, but we cannot fast track our way to maturity by simply mimicking the way we think a mature person would talk. We have to actually learn to get in touch with ourselves, bring who we are into the conflicts we're having, and stay present and receptive to the other person as they actually are, not as we think they should be. And only then can we develop those responsive and flexible styles that allow us to navigate through conflict well in a humongous variety of situations. And the final construct we're going to talk about today that tends to get discussed in conversations about maturity is responsibility. So essentially, the ability to be able to rise to the practical challenges of one's life and consistently meet them head on. And I think that something it is really easy to mistake for responsibility is rigidity. So when we do not know how to self-regulate against things like existential anxiety or uncomfortable feelings, having really rigid routines in place can compensate a lot for that. And it can make us feel safe and contained inside of uncertain circumstances. But life is one giant uncertain circumstance. And if the only way we know how to be consistent in our responses to meeting challenges are to control every aspect of our lives, we're not going to have a very flexible skill set for moving through a lot of areas of life that require engagement with more uncertainty. So instead of rigid self-discipline, what we really want to look at developing in our lives is a sense of devotion. So the ability to both check in with ourselves and routinely evaluate what it is that matters to us, what our hearts really want out of our lives, and then find the best possible route towards consistently fulfilling that for ourselves or for other people if what we want for our lives is some sort of mission that's greater than ourselves. And usually kind of a balance of both is what makes for a satisfying life. But we need to be able to figure out how to put the things that matter most to us at the center of our lives, and then be flexible and adaptable in how we meet those needs. I do have a whole video on this that I'll link in the description of this video, but essentially getting rid of this idea that the only way to be successful in life is to be extremely regimented about the way that we are approaching it, which very often, by the way, is why a lot of us struggle so much to be disciplined. Because if we have that belief that the only way to be a responsible person is to force myself to act in a highly specific and regimented way regardless of how I'm feeling or what feels right to me, we might have a fairly consistent no response to that in our body. Our bodies are probably properly reacting to that not being a very authentic way to live. And so again, we want to find that middle ground of figuring out what matters to us and figuring out a whole bunch of different routes we could take to stay connected to what matters to us most in life, that are adaptable as the circumstances of our lives continuously change and surprise us, which they absolutely are always going to. So the point that I really want to drive home here is that for any of the principles of maturity to apply to us in a consistent way, we have to be bringing our whole authentic selves into them instead of trying to detach from ourselves in order to perform maturity. So we want to look at how we or other people are best showing up as interdependent, present, congruent, responsive, and devoted to the things that matter to us in life. And the more we can move towards these things in a way that takes our whole selves on board with us as we go, the more resilient our own concept of maturity becomes. Because it's no longer something that's dependent upon our lives fitting into a certain set of circumstances. It's a responsive program that we can take with us through anything that life throws our way. All right, this is obviously very far from the only things that we could be talking about when it comes to maturity. So if you have other thoughts on the matter or any questions or any things you want to riff on, please leave it in the comments section below. As always, I love you guys. I hope you're taking care of yourselves and each other, and I will see you back here again really soon.